Hello, YouTube. This is myOtherArray. So in the previous three lessons, we've been talking about object-oriented programming. In lesson 2, in lesson 22, we basically talked about the very basics of object-oriented programming. And we said first we need to declare private instance variables. So in our person class, we have two instance variables, a string and an int. And then in our constructor, basically that's a method that's responsible for creating an instance of a class. And what that does is it assigns the instance variables to the parameters that are passed in. So for lesson 22, we just had one constructor. We just basically said we could pass in a string and then an int and then assign the name equals n, age equals a, right? But then in lesson 23, we said we could have different types of constructors. So maybe we could just pass in a name and then the age would be a default value like 53. Or maybe we just pass in the age and we could just, and then the name would be default like Mary Scott, and then only the age would be parameterized. Only the age would be assigned according to what the programmer told us. And then it looks like our default constructor got deleted, but we could have a default constructor where we have default values for both of the fields, right? So we could say name equals Jim and age equals 61. So that's an example. So these are examples. There's 4 types of constructors here, and it's up to you how much freedom you want to give the programmer, how much freedom, I guess, you want to give yourself, and how the instance variables get assigned, and then which ones could take default values. And then we also talked about getter methods. So we said usually the instance variables will be private, but the getter methods can be public. And we talked in lesson 24 a little bit about the difference between public and private fields. And fields are just either methods or variables. So public means that it can be referenced from outside of the class. So we had a person tester class, and if we had a public field, then there would be no issue with accessing it. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if we say person f equals new person of Renee and 14, and we said system.out.println of f.age, then there would be an issue here because we're trying to call a variable that's private. But if we went ahead and had a main method inside of our person class, which is where the name and the age instance variables were declared, then there would be no issue with calling p.age minus 7 or p.name concatenated with dog. Okay, there's no issue with that whatsoever. So now if we went ahead and did that, then there would be no issue with referencing it. So now if we went ahead and called we would just get pat dog, right? Because it's just the name concatenated with dog. So anyway, that's the difference between public and private, is can we access it? Can we call something directly from within or not? And if we said get name, if we made the get name method private, then the issue that we would have here is then if we went into the person tester class, then we wouldn't even be able to call the get name method from outside. Even it would underline get name, and we would say you can't even use that outside of person. So hopefully that establishes the difference between public and private. The other thing we talked about is a toString method. We talked about that in lesson 23, and we said basically if you have a toString method, we haven't talked about inheritance yet, but every class we make is automatically a subclass of the object class. And the way that the object class basically prints an object, the string representation of an object is a hexadecimal representation of the hash code, unless you're talking about a string. So here, if we make a public string toString, it allows us to have a very clean representation of printing an object. And you could call the instance .toString, right? But you don't even have to call .toString. So if we go ahead and do that here, you could either say f, if you want to say Renee is 14 years old. According to how we made the toString method, that's what would be printed here. So you have Renee is 14 years old. Or alternatively, you can just say f.toString, but the implication is there. It's the same either way, and that's the effect that's the effect that would be, that's the effect. Okay, so Renee is 14 years old. And then we also talked about the difference between static and instance. I think that's and then also the this keyword. So there's 2 more things to review. So remember, this prevents confusion between the instance variable, which is going to be on the left. Usually we're going to be assigning that either in a setter method or of course in a constructor when we first create the object. So using this prevents confusion, ambiguity between the instance variable, which goes on the left, and the parameter name which goes on the right. And if you just hate the idea of using this, then call the parameter right here in the method header something other than the name of the instance variable. Call it n or something like that. And so finally, the last thing we talked about is the difference between a static and an instance method. Okay, so essentially, if you have a person tester here, we had an issue with calling isOn in lesson 24 directly, right? So if we said system.out.println of isOn of hey, then there's an issue with that, right? Because we normally would be able to, oh, well, this is a static method right now, so there's no issue with calling isOn if it's static, right? And you could even, since we're in the same class, you don't have to write person tester, but technically you could write person tester dot isOn of hey, because we said that a static method refers directly to a class rather than an instance of a class. So person tester dot isOn of hey, or you could just say isOn of hey, and in both cases, according to this, it would return true. Okay, but the issue here, so then what if you make this an instance method, then you can't just call isOn of hey, you would have to create an instance of the class that it's in. So you'd say person tester u equals new person tester. Okay, and then you could say system.out.println of u.isOn of hey. So I think that's enough review. Let's talk about arrays. We already are familiar with arrays a little bit, and we already could have an array of string objects, for example. So Harry and Tom and Scott, and these are just names, right? And Mike, okay. And then you could have an array of ints, right? So you could say int u equals 52, 42, 32, and 22. And we also talked briefly when we were in, I think, lesson 16 or 17, what was it, lesson 16, I think, about two-dimensional arrays, and or lesson 17, about two-dimensional arrays. And we said basically we could have a one-dimensional array of one-dimensional arrays, and as long as they're the same data type. So anyway, you're pretty familiar with this, and we could practice on different types of arrays. You could say int counter equals 0, and you could say, well, counter is less than k dot length. And then you know the length property of an array, and you could say system.out.println of basically k of counter, right? And then you'd have to increment the counter each time, and then of course that would print the names that you see in that array there. So we need to close up that double quotation there, and then if we go ahead and compile and close, you're already familiar with this, so you know how to do that. And then similarly, you could have either a for loop or a for each loop to go through the ints there. So you could say for int x and u, for each of the integers in u, and I'm going to arbitrarily refer to the integers as x, I want you to print x, print that integer. So go ahead and do that. And then you would just go ahead and get those ages cascading down in a line. You could also have a two-dimensional array, but let's first talk about a one-dimensional array of objects. So a string is an object, right? So we already have an array of objects here. This is an array of objects. But let's have an array of the objects that we've been creating along the way. So we created this class called person, and it has attributes, right? And we've defined what it means to have a person object. And so you can see that here. I don't know why the lines always collapse like that when I open it. It's really frustrating. But let's create an array of person objects. So what you could do in the person tester class is go ahead and do that. So first let's create some person objects, and we could test the constructors that we had in the other class. So we could say person1 equals new person. So that just tests the default constructor. And then we're going to have person2 equals new person of Mike. That just tests the constructor where we only pass in the name and the age is default. Then we could have person p equals new person of 50. That's the constructor where we only pass in an int. We only pass in their age, and then the name is default. I think we have that in there. And then finally, we could have the full constructor where we have both parameters. So we could have something like Sammy and 33. And then so those will be our four person objects, and we could basically file those into an array. And we said there's two ways that we could basically create an array. We could either just have an empty array, so we could say something like person group equals new person of 4, right? And then we could say group of 0 equals P1, for example. Group of 1 equals P2. Group of 2 is P3, and group of 3 is P4. And then you could also, there's another way to create a one-dimensional array, and that is to just go ahead and file them in with curly braces and to just put the objects or the variables within there, the numbers within there. So what you could do, let's go ahead and create some more person objects, because in this video I want to demonstrate a two-dimensional array again. So we're going to say person p5 equals new person of, let's do Walter White, 50. And then we could say person p6, p7, p8. So this is just declaring person objects without yet initializing them. So p6 would be new person of Renee and 29. And then p7 would be new person. Let's do all Breaking Bad. So Skylar White, I don't know how old she is. Let's say 49. And then we have Walter Jr. Okay, and he's 16. And then we have PA equals new person. I think they have a baby, right? So Holly and 1. And then you could go ahead and make a family out of that. So let's go ahead and say person families. This is going to be a new one-dimensional array of person objects. And we'll create it just by saying P5, P6, P7, and P8. And so that would be a way to file in these person objects into this one-dimensional array. And so now if we go ahead and say, we could have another type of array. So we could say for int q equals 0, q is less than family.length, which will be 4 here because that's the number of person objects in the family array, q equals q plus 1. What we would do here is we would basically be able to print each of those person objects according to the toString method that we wrote in the person class. So we would say system.out.println of family of q, and then what we would get is we would basically get this Breaking Bad stuff. So now what happens is we run the main method and we get the printout of the 4 person objects. Let's go ahead and create a two-dimensional array of so that would be a one-dimensional array of one-dimensional arrays, because we already brought up two-dimensional arrays a little bit, but I want to go ahead and say a little bit more about it. So what we're going to do is take this sandbox code out from earlier in the video. So recall that we have 2 one-dimensional arrays. First, we have the Mike, Sammy stuff that we did up here, where we said group, group of 0, group of 1, group of 2, and group of 3. And then we have this Walter White stuff going on in the family array. It's a one-dimensional array of person objects. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and come up with a matrix. We're going to come up with a matrix of people. So it's going to be a two-dimensional array of person objects. And it's going to have 2 arrays in it, and each of those arrays are going to have 4 person objects. So it's going to be, you should be looking up at the code. Hopefully it's not too much to see the entire screen here, but essentially what we would do is we would say matrix of people, and then into that two-dimensional array we're going to file in group and family. So this is putting each of those one-dimensional arrays into this two-dimensional array. And what I want to do is I want to print the ages of everyone in this matrix. So first we're going to iterate through the group array and print the ages of these 4 person objects. And then we're going to iterate through the family array and print the ages of these 4 person objects. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do it with a nested while loop. So I think in a previous video we talked about a nested for loop, and we looked at basically a matrix, an array of numbers, and I basically showed you how we have to iterate through the arrays, and then within each of the arrays we have to iterate through the elements, and that's what's going to happen here. So we're going to have 2 counters, C1 and C2. We'll initialize C1 to be 0 outside of the first while loop, and then we're going to say, well, C1 is less than matrix of people dot length. So what this would do is this would allow C1 to go from 0 to basically 2. So it goes through the families in the two-dimensional array. And then within that, you're going to basically, within that, you need to refresh, and you need to start at the beginning of the family each time. So what you're going to do is you're going to, within that, say C2 equals 0, and then while C2 has not made it to the end of either of those one-dimensional arrays yet. So how do we know how long that is? Well, in this case, it would be 4. But if we didn't know that, you can just say, you could just look at the length of that one-dimensional array. How do we get to that one-dimensional array? Well, it's one of the elements of the two-dimensional array. So you would say matrix of people of 0 dot length. because matrix of people of 0, yes, it's an element of this matrix of people, but it's also an array in and of itself. So you would say, well, C2 is less than that length, which here would be 4. What you would do is you would say system.out.println, let's return the floating point representation of that person's age. So you would say matrix of people of, and then the first index position refers to which family we're talking about, and then the second index position refers to, you know, which member within that. So are you talking about, you know, P1, P2, P3, or P4, you know, or are you talking about, you know, P5, you know, or P5 or P, you know, so you get the idea. You have to go, you have to pick a family, and then within each family you have to talk about which family member. So the C1 and C2 are the distinctions for that. And then you're just going to go ahead and print all that stuff right there, and then you can go ahead and increment C2 within the inner while loop, and then within the outer while loop you're going to increment C1. So let's go ahead. So it's trying to basically convert a person object to a double, and it doesn't know how to do that. So here we were looking for their age. So we do know how to convert an int to a double. So we're just going to get the age of each person and basically tack a 0.0 onto it, because we know that that's the effect of the double right there. And we're just doing that for fun, just to demonstrate how a nested while loop works. So hopefully you're getting a little bit more familiar conceptually with how to with what a two-dimensional array is and how to work with it. So we're expecting 8 floating point numbers to show up at the console when we run the main method. And indeed, that's what we have. So we see the ages of the Breaking Bad people. Those are all floating point representations. And then we have 4 doubles right there. So hopefully we understand where those are coming from, right? Because we said essentially when we called the first constructor, or when we called the P1, right? When we made P1, that was the super default constructor. So if we don't pass in anything, it created a 61-year-old, right? That's what we did. That's what we saw earlier. So we can go see that now just to verify it, right? So person, and then we scroll up and we look at the default constructor, and it creates a 61-year-old Jim. So that's what happens here. So that's why we get 61.0 there. And so hopefully that's clear to you, and that's what's going on here. And then we were still printing the family of Q, right? Family of Q. And according to our toString method, that prints, you know, their name, and then is, and then their age, and then years old. So hopefully you can see these concepts coming together, and it's clear to you why we have C1 equals 0 outside of this first while loop. But then inside of this while loop, we have to reset C2 to 0 each time, so that we look at the beginning of the family each time. So that's sort of what I wanted to say about arrays of objects. Basically, not only can we have arrays of ints and doubles and booleans and characters, but we can also, you know, obviously have arrays of strings, and better yet, we can have arrays of objects just in general, as long as they're the same data type. So these are all person objects, so it's no sweat to add them. And then you could just immediately create your own from here. So you could say, you know, person, and then you could say squad, and then just immediately file in these objects however you see fit. You could file in the same person objects however many times you want. So there you have an array of 6 person objects and 4 are duplicates. So there's a lot of freedom in this, and hopefully you can play around with this functionality for yourself, test your understanding of arrays, the toString method, the use of the keyword this, difference between public and private fields. And then in the next video, we're going to be talking about the integer class and the double class, which we actually have not yet discussed. So we'll talk about wrappers. So that'll be a new topic, but for now, I think that's enough from you, Milso3. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.